Sophie Green stood in front of the tall glass building of Hawthorne Industries, her heart racing. She clutched the folder tightly in her hands, the papers inside heavy with the truth she was about to reveal. Sophie had never been in a place like this before. The building was sleek and modern, its glass windows reflecting the city around it. The lobby, filled with expensive furniture and bright lights, made her feel small and out of place. She was dressed in simple jeans and a blouse, nothing like the polished, expensive outfits worn by the staff and visitors around her. Maximilian Hawthorne, the CEO of Hawthorne Industries, was a name known by everyone. He was a powerful businessman with a reputation for being tough and focused. But Sophie knew that beneath his cold, hard exterior, he was still grieving the loss of his wife, Isabella. Sophie had never met Maximilian before, but she had heard about him. He was a man who lived in a world of wealth, business deals, and power. He had built an empire, but the death of Isabella had shattered him. Sophie wasn't sure how he would react to the news she was about to deliver, but she had no choice. As she walked through the lobby, Sophie couldn't help but feel out of place. Everything in the building was so polished, so perfect. The bright lights, the expensive decorations, it was all so different from the life she had known. She was just a simple girl who worked hard to make ends meet, but today she was about to walk into Maximilian's world and change everything. Sophie walked up to the security desk in the lobby, her hands still shaking as she gripped the folder. She cleared her throat and spoke with as much confidence as she could muster. "Excuse me, I need to speak with Mr. Hawthorne. It's about his wife, Isabella." The security guard looked her up and down, his eyes narrowing. He must have noticed that Sophie didn't quite fit in with the sleek, professional crowd in the lobby. Sophie's worn jeans and simple blouse were a far cry from the sharp suits and designer dresses around her. The guard raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. "Do you have an appointment?" he asked, his tone already suggesting he knew the answer would be no. Sophie nodded, swallowing hard. "No, but it's urgent. It's about Mrs. Hawthorne. It's important that I speak with him." The guard hesitated for a moment, then picked up the phone. After a short conversation, he put the phone down and stood up. "Wait here. I'll let them know you're here." Sophie took a deep breath as she sat down in the lobby. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever. She was anxious, her stomach in knots as she waited for someone to come and escort her up to see Maximilian Hawthorne. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a woman appeared and introduced herself as the assistant. Without saying much, she led Sophie past the polished floors and glass walls to the elevator, which seemed to glide smoothly up to the executive floor. As they walked down a long hallway lined with expensive art pieces, Sophie's nerves grew. The walls were decorated with large paintings that looked like they cost more than her entire year's salary. The offices she passed had large windows with stunning views of the city. Everything screamed wealth and power, and Sophie felt smaller with every step. When they finally reached the end of the hallway, the assistant stopped in front of a large oak door. "Mr. Hawthorne will see you now," she said without emotion before walking away. Sophie stood there for a moment, taking a deep breath before knocking on the door. She felt her heart beating faster as the door swung open. Inside, Maximilian Hawthorne stood by a massive desk, his back to her as he looked out of the floor-to-ceiling windows. His presence was commanding, and his cold, sharp gaze made her feel instantly nervous. His dark hair was peppered with silver at the temples, and his broad shoulders made him look even more intimidating. Sophie had imagined meeting him before, but nothing prepared her for this moment. "Come in," he said with a clipped, impatient tone, not even turning to face her. Sophie stepped into the office and the door closed behind her with a soft click. The space was just as grand as the hallway, filled with sleek furniture and expensive decor. It was like stepping into a place that didn't belong to someone like her. Sophie stood in front of his desk, feeling completely out of place. Maximilian finally turned to look at her, his face unreadable. His piercing blue eyes assessed her, waiting for her to speak. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice cool and uninterested. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, but now that she was face to face with Maximilian, the words felt heavy on her tongue. She forced herself to speak, keeping her voice steady. "Sir, your wife, Isabella, hired me as a surrogate before she died. I'm carrying your child." Maximilian's expression didn't change, but Sophie could see the flash of disbelief in his eyes. His lips tightened and without a word, he motioned toward the door. "Get out," he said quietly, but his voice was filled with cold anger. Sophie's heart dropped. This was not how she had imagined this conversation going. She had expected disbelief but not rejection. She quickly pulled the folder from her bag and placed it on the desk. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. I have the documents. I'm telling the truth. Maximilian's eyes hardened, and he stood up from his chair, his imposing figure towering over her. I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but you've made a serious mistake. Now. Sophie's heart sank. She knew this would be hard to believe. But she wasn't going to back down now. She placed the folder carefully on his desk, opened it, and pulled out the legal documents inside. I have the proof, she said softly, her voice shaking. Isabella made arrangements for me to be the surrogate after her cancer diagnosis. She wanted to keep it a secret from you because she didn't want you distracted from your work. She didn't want you to worry about her condition while you were focused on business. Maximilian's eyes flickered to the documents. He stepped forward and grabbed them, scanning the pages quickly, but Sophie could see the disbelief still written all over his face. He read through the legal agreement, his face changing from confusion to anger. His jaw clenched tightly as he read. This can't be real, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. His fingers gripped the papers so tightly that Sophie could see them trembling. Isabella would have told me about this. She would have. Sophie didn't back down. She stood her ground, her eyes fixed on him. She didn't tell you because she knew you were focused on the business merger in Singapore. She didn't want to distract you or make you worry about her illness. She made me promise not to contact you until after the first trimester of the pregnancy. Maximilian's face went pale as he continued to read through the documents. Sophie could see the shock beginning to settle in. She could tell that he was struggling to accept what she was saying, but the evidence was right in front of him. His eyes moved from the documents to Sophie, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. He placed the papers back down on the desk and ran his hand over his face, his mind clearly racing. I don't understand, he said, his voice shaking slightly. Why would she keep this from me? Why wouldn't she tell me? Why would she? Sophie stepped forward slightly, her voice gentle but firm. She wanted to give you the family you always wanted. She knew she didn't have much time left and she didn't want you to be alone. She wanted this child to be a part of both of you. Maximilian was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching the documents again as if he was looking for something that would explain all of this. His hands trembled as he touched the papers, and it was clear to Sophie that the shock was starting to sink in. Finally he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. This is impossible. But Sophie could see the doubt in his eyes begin to fade, replaced by a reluctant understanding. He looked at the folder again, his mind clearly trying to process everything. The walls he had built around his heart were slowly starting to crack. Maximilian looked up at Sophie, his face pale but determined. If this is true, why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she let me be a part of this? Sophie's voice softened. She was afraid of worrying you. She loved you too much to add more pressure. She didn't want you to feel like you had to deal with everything at once. But now here I am. Maximilian stood still for a moment, the weight of the revelation settling on him. It was a lot to take in, and Sophie knew that it would take time for him to fully accept the truth. But at least now he had no choice but to face it. Isabella didn't use the usual clinic or lawyer, Sophie began, watching Maximilian carefully. She wanted to keep everything private, away from you. She knew how much you were focused on the merger and your work, and she didn't want to add to your stress. She didn't want to distract you, and she was afraid that if you knew, you might worry about her illness instead of the business. Maximilian's eyes narrowed as he processed this new information. She went to a different clinic? He asked, his voice strained. She didn't even tell me? Sophie nodded. Yes. She went to a clinic she found through a friend, one that promised complete confidentiality. She also hired a lawyer who wasn't connected to your firm, just to make sure no one would find out. Isabella knew you were under so much pressure with the merger, and she didn't want you to be distracted or overwhelmed. Maximilian's face was a mixture of disbelief and frustration. I don't understand. Why didn't she just tell me? Why didn't she let me help her? Sophie hesitated, then spoke again, her voice quiet. Because of her illness. She didn't want you to see her that way. She didn't want to take away your focus on the business. I think she was trying to protect you in a way. Maximilian's brow furrowed as he listened. His expression softened for a moment as he seemed to recall something. She was always like that, he said, more to himself than to Sophie. Always taking care of everyone else, always making sure I didn't have to worry about anything. Even when she was sick. Sophie nodded, her eyes filled with empathy. Isabella didn't want you to carry any more burden than you already had. She wanted you to have the family you always dreamed of. She wanted you to have a child, even though she knew she couldn't give it to you herself. Maximilian's eyes softened as he looked at Sophie. She knew about her illness? He asked, his voice cracking. She knew she didn't have much time left? Sophie swallowed, her own emotions threatening to break through. Yes. She found out about her cancer coming back a few months before she hired me. She didn't tell you because she didn't want you to stop everything for her. She didn't want to pull you away from your work. She made me promise not to tell you until after the first trimester so you wouldn't worry. Maximilian took a step back, his face pale as he processed this new revelation. She kept that from me? She was fighting for her life and I didn't even know. Sophie could see the hurt in his eyes, but she also saw the love he had for Isabella. She didn't want you to see her as weak. She didn't want you to remember her that way. She wanted to leave you with something that would give you hope after she was gone. And she thought the best way to do that was by giving you a child. She wanted to make sure that you wouldn't be alone. Maximilian stood still for a long moment, taking in everything Sophie had said. His mind was racing, trying to understand why Isabella had kept so many secrets. But deep down he knew that it was all done out of love, for him, for their family, and for the future. I never realized how much she was protecting me, Maximilian said softly, his voice filled with sadness. I had no idea. I just thought she was getting weaker. I never knew the truth. I never knew she was trying to make sure I wouldn't be alone. Sophie stepped forward, her voice gentle. Isabella loved you more than anything. And she wanted you to have everything you always wanted, even if she couldn't be there to give it to you herself. Maximilian's gaze dropped to the floor, his hands shaking slightly. He had a lot to process, but Sophie could see the walls around him beginning to crack. It would take time, but Sophie was beginning to believe that he might finally understand what Isabella had done for him. Maximilian sat quietly at his desk, holding the envelope in his hands. Sophie watched as he slowly opened it, her heart pounding. The letter inside was written in Isabella's familiar handwriting, the letters flowing gracefully across the paper. She had always been so careful with her words, even in the toughest times. Sophie could see the emotions playing out on Maximilian's face as he read each line, his eyes scanning the words with growing intensity. At first, his expression was hard to read. He looked down at the letter as if trying to make sense of the message Isabella had left for him. But then, as he read deeper, his face softened, and Sophie saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before: vulnerability. The stern, businesslike mask he had worn since she met him began to crack, and for the first time Sophie could see the raw grief underneath. The room fell silent except for the sound of Maximilian's breathing. Sophie waited, feeling a knot tighten in her chest. She knew what was in the letter. It was the truth that Isabella had hidden for so long, but she couldn't help but feel nervous. What would Maximilian think of all this? Finally, Maximilian set the letter down on the desk, his hand trembling. His eyes met Sophie's, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Sophie's heart was heavy with guilt and uncertainty. She had never imagined this would be her role, carrying Isabella's child, and now standing here, watching Maximilian struggle with everything he had lost. I never knew. Maximilian's voice was barely above a whisper. I never knew how much she was protecting me. I didn't realize the lengths she went to keep this secret. His voice cracked slightly, the weight of Isabella's love and sacrifice hitting him all at once. Sophie's own eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. I never wanted to hurt you, Sophie said softly, her voice filled with regret. I didn't know how to tell you, but I had to. She made me promise to keep it a secret until after the first trimester. She thought you'd be too focused on your work, too distracted to deal with her illness. Maximilian stood up slowly, pacing the room, as if trying to make sense of everything that had just been revealed. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, grief, anger, confusion, and he didn't know how to handle it all. She kept it all from me, he muttered. She was sick, and I had no idea. She tried so hard to protect me, and I was so focused on my work that I didn't even notice. Sophie felt her own guilt deepen. I'm sorry, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't want to be the one to tell you this. I didn't want to bring all this pain back. Maximilian stopped pacing and looked at her, his face filled with pain. It's not your fault. She chose to keep this from me. But I wish I had known. His voice faltered, and for a moment he looked lost. Sophie knew he was grieving not just for Isabella, but for the lost time and the things he never got to say to her. Maximilian slowly walked back to his desk, picking up Isabella's letter again. His fingers traced the edges of the paper as if trying to feel a connection to her, even in her absence. I never knew how much she loved me, he said quietly, his voice full of sorrow. I never knew how much she was willing to sacrifice for me. Sophie took a deep breath. She loved you more than anything. She just wanted you to be happy even if it meant keeping this secret. Maximilian's eyes softened as he looked at her. And now, you're carrying her child, he said, his voice filled with a mixture of emotions. She gave me this even after everything that happened. This is the last piece of her. Sophie nodded, her heart aching as she realized the magnitude of what had happened. Yes, she did. And now, we have to honor her wish. The silence that followed was filled with unspoken emotions. Maximilian and Sophie were both wrestling with their own grief, uncertainty, and the deep, complicated bond that now tied them together. They both understood the weight of what had been left behind, and the responsibility they would share going forward. Maximilian's mind was racing. The letter from Isabella had confirmed much of what Sophie had said, but doubt still lingered in his mind. The idea that someone might be using his late wife's name to manipulate him, to deceive him, was too much to ignore. His business world was filled with deals, risks, and betrayal, and he couldn't afford to make mistakes now. Something doesn't add up, Maximilian muttered to himself as he stared out of his office window. The letter from Isabella was real, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Sophie's story sounded too perfect, too well planned. It was almost as if someone had orchestrated it all. He couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. He picked up the phone and called his lawyer. I want you to investigate Sophie Green. Find out everything about her, who she really is, where she comes from. Look into her background, her family, her past relationships. Especially her connection to James Caldwell. James Caldwell was a name Maximilian knew all too well. James had worked for his company until 6 months ago when Maximilian had fired him for attempting to sell company secrets to a rival firm. He'd been a trusted employee, until he betrayed that trust. Maximilian had always suspected James of being capable of more deceit, and now, with Sophie linked to him, he couldn't ignore the possibility that she might be involved in something shady. As the days passed, the investigation into Sophie's past was launched. Maximilian's lawyer hired private investigators to dig into every detail of her life, and what they found was troubling. Sophie had a history with James Caldwell. They had been in a relationship, but they broke up over a year ago, or so Sophie had claimed. However, the investigators uncovered phone records showing that Sophie had been in contact with James only a few months before she came forward as Isabella's surrogate. The news hit Maximilian hard. Sophie's connection to James felt like a betrayal, and he couldn't help but wonder if she was using this situation to her advantage. Had she been working with James all along? Was she trying to gain something from him, just like James had tried to do with the company? Sophie was called into Maximilian's office again. She had no idea what had been discovered, but as soon as she entered, she could feel the tension in the air. Maximilian stood by the window, his back to her. The silence in the room was heavy, and Sophie could feel the weight of his eyes on her when he finally spoke. Why didn't you tell me the truth? Maximilian's voice was cold, but there was a hint of frustration there. Why didn't you tell me about your connection to James Caldwell? Sophie's heart sank. She had expected this confrontation, but the accusations still hurt. I didn't have anything to do with James, she said quickly, trying to defend herself. We broke up a long time ago. I haven't spoken to him since then. I swear, I'm not trying to deceive you. Maximilian turned to face her, his eyes piercing. Then why was he calling you? Why did he contact you so recently? Sophie took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. James tried to contact me, yes, but I didn't respond. I haven't seen him in months. And I'm not part of whatever he's trying to do. I never wanted any of this to happen. I didn't want to get involved in your business, Maximilian. I didn't want to be here like this, but Isabella? Isabella trusted you? Maximilian interrupted, his voice harsh. She trusted you with something so important, and yet here I am, questioning everything. Do you understand how that feels? Sophie's heart tightened. I understand. I do. But everything I've told you is the truth. Isabella confided in me because she trusted me. She wanted you to have this child, and I promised her I would keep it a secret until she was gone. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm not here to scam you. Maximilian stood silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on Sophie. The suspicion in his eyes hadn't faded, but a part of him was beginning to doubt everything the investigators had found. It wasn't like Sophie to be involved in a scheme. Still, he needed to know the truth. He needed to be sure. I'm sorry, Maximilian finally said, his voice softer than before. But I need more than just your word. I need to know that you're telling the truth. Sophie nodded, her own frustration rising. I've told you everything. I'm not hiding anything from you. Maximilian stared at her for a long moment. He still didn't know if he could trust her, But he couldn't ignore the possibility that maybe, just maybe, Sophie wasn't part of some fraud. Yet the questions remained. What was the truth? And why had Isabella kept all of this from him? The day of the ultrasound arrived, and the tension between Sophie and Maximilian was palpable. They sat in the waiting room of the fertility clinic, each lost in their own thoughts. Maximilian's jaw was tight, his gaze distant as he stared at the walls. Sophie sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, her heart racing. She knew this was the moment that could change everything. Sophie could feel the weight of Maximilian's eyes on her, but she didn't dare look up. She had done everything she could to prove her honesty, but nothing could prepare her for what was about to happen. Would this ultrasound be the final confirmation of what Isabella had planned, or would it be the moment everything fell apart? After what felt like hours, a nurse came into the waiting room, smiling warmly. "Mr. Hawthorne, Miss Green," she said. "Please follow me, we're ready for your ultrasound." Sophie stood, trying to steady her nerves, and followed the nurse down the hall. Maximilian walked beside her, his expression unreadable. They entered a small examination room, and Sophie lay down on the table as instructed. The nurse applied the cold gel to her abdomen, and the monitor flickered to life. The sound of a heartbeat filled the room, and Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Maximilian's eyes locked onto the screen, and for the first time, Sophie saw something other than suspicion in his gaze. He stepped closer to the monitor, his face softening as he watched the image on the screen. The nurse moved the wand gently over Sophie's belly, showing them the baby's developing form. "There's your baby, Mr. Hawthorne," she said, pointing to the screen. "Everything looks perfect. The baby is growing as expected." Maximilian's eyes remained fixed on the monitor, his expression tense but slowly softening. Sophie could see the change in him. His hardened exterior, built up from months of grief and distrust, was starting to crack. His eyes seemed to shimmer with something Sophie hadn't seen before, emotion. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was the realization that he was truly going to be a father. The nurse continued to point out details on the ultrasound, but Maximilian barely seemed to hear her. His attention was entirely focused on the baby. Sophie could tell this was a moment he had longed for, even though he had never allowed himself to hope for it. "Would you like to know the baby's gender?" the nurse asked gently. Maximilian's voice was barely audible when he replied. "Yes," he said, his tone thick with emotion. The nurse smiled and looked at the monitor. "It's a boy," she said softly. A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at Maximilian's lips as he looked at Sophie. The walls between them seemed to lower just a little. He still had so many questions, but in this moment he saw the truth in Sophie's eyes. This wasn't a scam. This wasn't part of some elaborate scheme. The baby was real and it was his. Sophie looked at him, her voice shaky. "Isabella wanted you to have this, Maximilian. She wanted you to have the family you always dreamed of. She loved you more than you could ever know." Maximilian didn't answer right away. He stood there watching the screen, lost in thought. The weight of everything that had happened in the past few days seemed to settle in his chest. But now, seeing the baby on the screen, he could finally understand what Isabella had done for him. He slowly turned to Sophie, his eyes softer now. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I've been so caught up in my own anger and grief that I couldn't see the truth. I didn't want to believe it." Sophie's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had spent so much time defending herself, but now, for the first time, she felt like Maximilian was starting to understand. She gave him a small, uncertain smile. "You don't have to apologize," she said softly. "I know it's been hard. It's been hard for both of us." Maximilian nodded, looking back at the monitor. "I'm going to be a father," he whispered, as if saying the words out loud made them more real. Sophie nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions. This wasn't the way she had imagined things happening, but in that moment, it felt like a new beginning. For the first time since they'd met, Sophie and Maximilian shared a quiet, meaningful moment together. One that marked the start of a new chapter for both of them. The emotional distance between them had started to crumble, and although there was still much to work through, they were no longer strangers to each other. They were connected now, not just by the memory of Isabella, but by the life growing inside of Sophie. And that connection, fragile as it was, held the promise of a future neither of them could have predicted. After the ultrasound, there was a shift between Sophie and Maximilian. The tension that had been hanging between them began to ease, though there was still much left unsaid. The baby was real and the truth was undeniable. But Maximilian still couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. He had trusted Isabella, loved her deeply, and yet she had kept so many secrets from him. It was hard to accept. That evening, back at his office, Maximilian sat in front of Isabella's journal, the same one she had left for him before her passing. Sophie had handed it to him earlier, and now as he opened the pages, he could feel the weight of her love and her regrets. Her words, written in the careful flowing script he knew so well, filled the pages. Each sentence was filled with emotion, her hopes, her fears, her love for him, and the secret plan she had kept hidden. Maximilian read through the journal slowly, taking in each word. Isabella had written about her illness, how she had known it was terminal, and how much it pained her to leave him behind. But what struck him most was how much she had wanted to protect him. She had feared that if she told him everything, about the cancer returning, about the surrogacy, he would have dropped everything and focused only on her. Isabella had known Maximilian's dedication to his work, and she didn't want him to be distracted. In one of the entries Isabella had written, "I want him to have everything he dreamed of. A family, a legacy. I can't give it to him, but I can help him get there." Those words hit Maximilian harder than he had expected. She hadn't kept these secrets out of selfishness. She had done it because she loved him, because she wanted him to have a chance at happiness, even after she was gone. Maximilian closed the journal and took a deep breath, feeling a lump in his throat. For the first time since Isabella's death, he allowed himself to grieve fully. He had been so focused on his anger and confusion that he hadn't truly let himself mourn. Isabella had tried so hard to protect him, but now all the walls he had built around himself seemed to crumble. Sophie had been right all along. She had been telling him the truth. He had been too caught up in his own pain to see it. The next morning he met with Sophie again. This time there was no anger in his eyes, only understanding. He looked at her with a softness she hadn't seen before. "I've read Isabella's journal," he said quietly. "And now I understand. She did all of this for me, for us. She wanted us to be a family even after she was gone." His voice was thick with emotion. "I didn't want to believe it, but now I know. I've been so lost in my grief that I didn't see what was in front of me." Sophie nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I never wanted to cause you pain. I just wanted to keep my promise to her." Maximilian took a deep breath, his voice steadying. I think we should honor her wish, Sophie. Together. We should raise this child together the way Isabella wanted. I've been so angry and confused, but now I see that she was only trying to give me something precious." Sophie felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had been waiting for this moment, for Maximilian to understand, to finally open his heart. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll do everything I can to make sure she's remembered. For the baby. For you." Maximilian nodded, a new sense of resolve in his eyes. "We'll get through this, Sophie. For Isabella. And for the baby. We're in this together now." With that, the walls between them finally came down. They weren't just two strangers connected by circumstance anymore. They were partners, bound by a love for a woman they both had lost and a child they would raise together. The path ahead would still be difficult, but now they had each other. And they would honor Isabella's final wish by building a future together. As the weeks passed, Sophie and Maximilian worked together to prepare for the arrival of Isabella's child. The journey had been difficult, full of grief, anger, and doubts, but they were no longer the strangers they once were. They had come to understand each other in ways they never expected. Isabella's memory had woven them together, and now, it was clear that they were bound not just by the child they would raise but by the love they both shared for the woman they had lost. They began to meet regularly, discussing the future, their roles as parents, and how they would honor Isabella's wishes. There were still moments of tension, but with each conversation, Sophie and Maximilian grew closer. They shared stories of Isabella, her strength, her kindness, her love for them both, and it was through these stories that their bond deepened. One afternoon, as Sophie sat on the balcony of Maximilian's home, she felt a flutter in her stomach. It was the baby Ethan, as they had decided to name him. It was still hard to believe that the child growing inside her was the symbol of everything they had been through. The loss, the pain, the secrets, all of it had led them here to this moment. Maximilian walked out onto the balcony, looking down at Sophie. He had been more present these past few weeks, taking time off from work to focus on what mattered most. As he stood next to her, his hand gently rested on her growing belly. "How is he today?" Maximilian asked softly, a rare smile playing on his lips. "He's active," Sophie said, looking up at him. "I think he knows we're getting close." Maximilian nodded, his eyes softening. "I'm ready for this," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "I know I haven't always been, but I am now. I want to be the father Ethan deserves, the father Isabella would have wanted me to be." Sophie smiled, feeling a wave of warmth fill her chest. "You're already the father he deserves, Maximilian?" You've always been, even before you realized it. Maximilian's expression softened, and he took Sophie's hand in his. We're going to be okay, Sophie. Together we'll make sure Ethan grows up surrounded by love, even in the face of everything we've lost. A few days later, Sophie went into labor. The day was long and filled with moments of fear, but Maximilian never left her side. He held her hand through the contractions, offering words of encouragement, his presence a steady source of support. By the time evening came, the room was filled with the sound of Ethan's cries as he was born into the world. The moment Sophie held him in her arms, her heart swelled with love for the little boy who would change everything. Maximilian stood beside her, his eyes full of awe as he looked at his son. He's perfect, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He's our future. Sophie looked up at Maximilian, her heart full of gratitude. He's our new beginning, she said softly, her voice filled with wonder. And in that moment, Sophie and Maximilian knew that they had built something new, something that would last. Ethan wasn't just a reminder of the past, he was a symbol of the future they would create together. A family forged through tragedy, but also filled with hope and love. The journey had been hard, but it had brought them to this beautiful, life-changing moment. Their bond was stronger than ever, and they would raise Ethan together, honoring Isabella's final wish while building their own family, one full of love, support, and new beginnings. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over the room, Sophie cradled her newborn son Ethan in her arms. She couldn't stop smiling as she gazed down at his tiny face, a perfect mix of her and Maximilian. The pain of the past seemed so distant now, replaced by the overwhelming joy of holding the future in her arms. Maximilian stood beside her, watching them both with a look of pure love and awe. The transformation in him was clear. He had embraced fatherhood fully, ready to provide for Ethan and to heal the wounds that had once torn him apart. He reached over and gently stroked Ethan's head, his face softening. We've made it through, Maximilian said quietly, his voice filled with gratitude. All the pain, the loss, it was all worth it to have him here. To have us here together. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes filled with emotion. We've created something beautiful, Maximilian. Something that's ours. Isabella wanted this for us, for Ethan. And now we're a family. Maximilian nodded, his eyes brimming with tears. Isabella's legacy isn't money or material things, he said, his voice trembling. It's the love she shared with us. It's the family we're building, the healing we're finding together. That's her gift to us. Sophie smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. And that's the future we'll give Ethan. A future full of love, healing, and hope. As they stood there, together, cradling their son, they knew that the hard times were behind them. The love they shared for Isabella had brought them together, and now, it would guide them as they raised Ethan. It was a new beginning, a fresh start, filled with endless possibilities. Their family was no longer broken, it was whole and the future was bright.